about what happens in Egypt, which is a really interesting example of how, the Ottoman Empire is ultimately, in a lot of ways, the central power of the Sultan is declining to more local examples of leadership. So, um, what we see here is that the Sultan is getting weaker, and someone like Muhammad Ali in Egypt is gaining more local prominence. The Sultan still technically rules over Egypt during this time, but has virtually no power. So, kind of showing you the increased weakening of the central government. All right, so at this point, the Egyptians had been dominated by a group of people called the Mamluks rather, Mamluks. They were Turkish people who formed a military class, and they are going to be overthrown by Napoleon in 1798 or 99. I have written there during his campaign to try to sort of find a Middle Eastern connection for France to markets in India. And so Napoleon basically ends up very briefly overthrowing the Mamluks, but we also see that the British want to protect their interests in the region, so they're going to try to help the Ottomans reestablish their presence in Egypt. Napoleon is going to return to France after this campaign, and French generals are going to have trouble ruling in Egypt, and eventually the control is going to fall back into the hands of the Mamluks. Where did we go? Okay. Yeah. So what we see happening is that the Ottomans are going to then send an army into Egypt to try to retake it. And one of their soldiers, a guy named Muhammad Ali, he was an Albanian Ottoman officer, ends up sort of coming to prominence during this conflict. And then the local leaders in Egypt select him to be the new governor. And at this point, the Sultan was weak enough that he could not really object to this. So what we see is that Muhammad Ali ultimately is emerging as effectively the ruler of Egypt, even though, again, the Ottomans are ultimately still technically presiding over Egypt, right? So sort of disintegrating centralized rule, right? Muhammad Ali is then going to spend the next 10 years or so consolidating power and defeating the various Mamluk leaders. So we're going to see that he's going to start to expand southward, also into the Arabian Peninsula and eventually Syria. For example, in Arabia over here, there's going to be an Islamic fundamentalist group called Wahhabis that are going to take control of Mecca and Medina from the Ottomans, which further weakens the empire. So then the Ottoman Sultan is going to ask Ali to then go into Arabia to recapture it. And he does this. It takes a number of years, but his campaign is successful. But then Ali wages campaigns in the south to try to gain control of Sudan for Egypt. And this is something that he does without the permission of the Sultan. So we see that, because he is an effective military ruler, because the Sultan sort of relies upon him to conduct military campaigns to help save the Ottomans, he feels like he has no choice but to just let the Sultan do this, right? So we see that Ali has sort of taken advantage of the military power that he's gained to gain more territory for himself. So we do see another example of this with the Greek independence movement. Basically, the Sultan, again, is going to ask Ali for his help. And he says that if Ali successfully maintains Greece under the control of the Ottoman Empire, that he will give Ali the island of Crete. So Ali sends an army and navy to Greece. But the problem is that, Greece is also getting significant help from Western European powers. And so we find that Ali and the Sultan's forces are not strong enough to overthrow Greece's supporters. The Egyptian navy is going to be destroyed, and Greece gains its independence in 1832. So this is really a further sign of the declining prominence of the Ottoman Empire. We see that their military has not modernized enough to challenge some of the Western European powers that were aiding Greece. And again, this Greek independence is going to result in a surge of nationalism in Greece, as well as the European states that help them out. And it also shows us that Ali's military might has limits, right? So actually, am I missing a slide here? No. Yeah, let's just stay here for a second because I have one more thing to say about Ali. So we're going to see that. Okay, perfect. After Ali loses his campaigns in Greece, he's not totally finished with his attempts to expand his control. So he's going to then invade Syria. one of the reasons why he wants Syria is because it has valuable trading centers and natural resources, things like iron ore and petroleum. So Ali gets his son Ibrahim to lead an Egyptian force to seize Syria in 1831 and 1832, which he does, right? So they win Syria, and then they start to try to move into Anatolia proper, right? So they're trying to move into Turkey. So it seems like the Egyptians are ultimately going to actually sort of encroach upon Ottoman territory and take it for themselves. But then European forces actually come in and force Egypt to withdraw from Anatolia. What we see, the reason why they do this is ultimately because if anyone has control over the future of the Ottoman Empire, the Europeans want to be the one who have that, because then they can decide what to do with the remains. So of course the French and British have a huge interest in this region. They ultimately want to get the Egyptians to lose some of their control over Egypt so that they can construct the Suez Canal, which they do in 1869. So basically, we're going to see that instead of allowing the Egyptians to keep expanding into Anatolia, they basically force them to withdraw. And then by 1882, you're going to have Egypt become a British protectorate. And so what that means is that the descendants of Muhammad Ali are still technically ruling, so it's still technically Egypt, but it's basically really limited in its power, and Great Britain is ultimately influencing a lot of the major decisions that are made to shape the future of Egypt up until 1952. This is happening. But despite this, Ali is attempting to modernize the Egyptian military system in particular. So it's important for us to realize the attempts that he makes to save Egypt. He does not completely break with the Sultan in all of his reforms, but he does try to act independently in some ways. And so one of the ways that he reforms his military is he tries to make over Egypt's army on more of a European model. For example, he starts to practice a more modern form of conscription, where he compels all men, including peasants, to become soldiers. And so there's a contrast between this and the way that the Sultan's army was constructed, because the Sultan's army was only made up of Janissaries, who we know were, these young Christian boys that converted to Islam and were very loyal to the Sultan. And so the argument is that, by issuing this practice of conscription that was less exclusive, some of the soldiers were less disciplined, and sometimes you'd have them depending on things like looting for wages instead of getting paid legally. Some more of the effective reforms that Ali underwent were in terms of education and promoting literacy. And so one of the things that he does is he is trying to westernize the Egyptian Empire by sending military officers in training to France to actually learn, European military tactics and formations. He also orders many texts to be translated from French into Arabic. And these texts that he translates are comprising a variety of subjects, including things like sociology and history, as well as military technology. So the idea is that they're studying things that are going to directly help them be better governmental administrators, as well as military rulers. He also starts an official newspaper, so it's the first major newspaper that's circulated throughout Egypt. He's also interested in proliferating a lot of Western and classical literature. So this is called the Arab Literary Renaissance, where we're going to see basically some of the Ottomans' experiences abroad are going to make them more interested in Enlightenment theory. We are going to see that this causes some Ottomans actually to push for more democratic governments, and some of them want to go so far as to do away with the Sultan. So by increasing the exposure to Western texts, it actually does, in a lot of ways, contribute to more of an internal decline in the Ottoman Empire. All right, going on to his economic reforms, and then we'll break and then start with a new slide and go back to the Sultan and look at Selim III. Okay, so Ali also tries to make reforms to the economy, but not all of them are very successful. So one of the major things that he does that really troubles the peasants is he taxes the peasants at such a high rate that they're forced to give lands up to the state. And then the government is also going to start controlling the cotton production, for example, and it does this so that it can make money off of its exports, as well as the exports of agricultural products. We're going to see that the government starts to seize religious lands, and this is going to put more agricultural produce into the hands of the government. So this is going to be good at the beginning, right? During the Napoleonic Wars, for example, wheat prices were really high in Europe. So when the government has control over agricultural produce, it makes a lot of money. But ultimately, we're going to see that the European agricultural sector will eventually recover after the Napoleonic Wars, and then the Ottomans will lose that profit source. He also significantly pushes Egypt to industrialize. So, for example, he builds textile factories to try to compete with those of the British and French. He builds armament factories in Cairo, and then also he sponsors the building of many other small shops in Cairo, which build things like bolts of cloth and other parts for military uniforms and weaponry. And then on his port city of Alexandria, he sets up shipbuilding factories. And he does this because he wants Egypt to develop its own navy, because he knows how important that is to catch up with Europe. So Ali was considered a really significant modern ruler because of all his attempts at industrializing Egypt. But the problem was, on the one hand, they're unable to actually finance this in a sustainable way. And Egypt is going to increasingly rely upon foreign support, European support, which is one of the reasons why Egypt becomes a protectorate of Great Britain. So ultimately, despite the fact that Ali is attempting to modernize Egypt, ultimately what we have is an era that was previously under Ottoman control that's then going to be controlled by a more local ruler who was Ali, and then ultimately fall much more into the hands of European influence. So Egypt is sort of one of the first little segments of the Ottoman Empire to fall out of the hands of the empire just because of this experience with Ali. The next video is going to be focusing on some of the last sultans of the Ottoman Empire that also are going to be enacting reforms, albeit they experience some significant resistance to some of these reforms, and of course will ultimately determine how this contributes to the Ottoman decline. So stay tuned.